I recently finished reading The Monster of Florence by Douglas Preston and Mario Spezi, and I went into it expecting a fairly straightforward true crime book. You know the kind. A serial killer, a police investigation, a list of suspects, maybe a dramatic reveal at the end, but that's not really what this book is. Instead, it's almost two books in one. The first half is about one of Italy's most infamous unsolved murder cases. The second half becomes something much stranger, a story about prosecutors, journalists, conspiracy theories, and how an investigation can spiral completely out of control. And honestly, I found that the second half was even more fascinating than the murderers, the murders themselves. So let's first talk about the Monster of Florence. That case centers on a serial killer known as the Monster of Florence who terrorized the Tuscan countryside between 1968 and 1985. The killer targeted young couples who had parked in secluded areas. At the time, many young Italians still lived with their parents, so driving into the countryside for privacy was common. Tragically, that also made the couples vulnerable. Across 8 double murders, 16 people were killed. One thing that's worth mentioning is despite decades of investigation, the identity of the monster has never been definitively established. That's one of the reasons the case continues to fascinate people today. Now, let's talk about the investigation. What happened during the investigation? The first part of the book walks you through the crimes. It's disturbing, but it's written more like investigative journalism than sensational true crime, and I think that's a positive for this book. Then the focus shifts. Instead of asking who was the killer, the book starts asking how did the investigation become such a mess? And that's where things get really interesting. One of the recurring themes is that investigators sometimes became attached to theories before the evidence actually supported them. For example, one suspect had committed violent crimes decades earlier, but by the time many of the murders occurred, he was elderly and physically frail. One of the victims had reportedly managed to run a considerable distance while trying to escape, so there's no way he could have done it. Um, and yeah, so it raises obvious questions about whether this particular a suspect, could realistically have committed the crime. And now let's talk about another aspect of this serial killer case, which is the picnic companions theory. So, one of the strangest parts of the investigation revolves around a phrase that on its own seems completely harmless. Someone described a group of friends as being picnic companions. That's it. But over time, prosecutors began building increasingly elaborate theories around these supposed picnic companions, eventually linking them to alleged occult rituals and satanic conspiracies. If that sounds unbelievable, it gets even stranger. The book describes how investigators also considered information from a self proclaimed psychic during the investigation. It's one of several moments where you're left wondering how speculation became treated almost like evidence. Now let's talk about one of the co authors of the book, Douglas Preston. He gets pulled into the whole thing. Here's what makes the book different from most true crime books. Douglas Preston wasn't originally researching the monster. He had moved to Italy planning to write fiction. Instead, after meeting Italian journalist Mario Spezi, he became deeply involved in investigating the real case. Eventually, Preston himself found his life affected by the investigation. Spezi was arrested on accusations of interfering with the inquiry, largely because he was pursuing alternative theories about the murders. So the irony here is really hard to ignore. A journalist investigating a criminal investigation ends up becoming part of the story himself. From that point on, the book almost stops being about a serial killer. It's about institutions, power, and what happens when officials become convinced they're right. Now, let's talk about another part about the book, which is the Amanda Knox connection. So, one detail that surprised me was the connection to another famous case. The prosecutor featured prominently in this book, Giuliano Mignini, later became internationally known for leading the investigation into the murder of Meredith Kircher, the case in which Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicisto were initially convicted before being definitively acquitted by Italy's highest court in 2015. The book doesn't spend much time on the Knox case, but knowing that connection gives some additional context to some of the investigative methods being discussed. Now let's talk about the bigger theme of this book. So the book becomes much more than true crime. It asks a difficult question. What happens when investigators become emotionally invested in a theory? Once someone with authority decides they know what happened, every new piece of evidence can start getting interpreted through that lens. And there's about a doorstop. There's a particularly interesting story in the book about that, but I won't tell you here. You should read the book and find out. Instead of the evidence changing the theory changes the meaning of the evidence. Whether you agree with Preston and Spezi's conclusions or not, it's a fascinating discussion about confirmation bias inside criminal investigations. So let's talk about some interesting facts connected to this book. A couple of interesting facts about the book itself, which I'll tell you right now. I'm just dramatically pausing for effect. Douglas Preston is best known as the co-author of numerous best-selling thriller novels with Lincoln Child, including the Pendergast series. Mario Spezi, he's the other co-author, wasn't just writing about the Monster of Florence. He had spent years covering the case as a crime reporter in Italy. Their different perspectives, one as an American outsider and the other as an Italian journalist, make the book especially engaging. The book was originally published in 2008 and has since become one of the best known English language accounts of the Monster of Florence case. So I guess Tom Cruise held the rights to this story, but they haven't made a movie. Although I did see recently there's a Netflix adaptation that came out, but I'm not sure if that's based on the book or the case. So you can let me know in the comments if that's worth checking out. If you're expecting a traditional true crime story where everything gets wrapped up at the end, this isn't that. The murders remain unsolved. The investigation becomes increasingly complicated and distracted, one would say. And by the end, the real mystery almost isn't the killer anymore. It's how an entire justice system can be locked into one particular narrative. Whether you agree with all of Preston and Spezi's arguments or not, the book raises some genuinely thought-provoking questions about investigations, prosecutors, journalism, and human nature. Personally, I thought it was incredibly well constructed. It's part true crime, part legal thriller, part memoir, and part cautionary tale. If you're interested in unsolved mysteries or books that go beyond simply recounting the crimes, I definitely recommend The Monster of Florence. It's one of the most unusual true crime books I've read because in the end, the investigation becomes just as compelling and just as mysterious as the murders themselves. All right, that's my review of The Monster of Florence by Mario Spezi and Douglas Preston. I'm trying to become the most prolific reviewer of all time. And to do that, I read a lot of books, I watch a lot of TV, and I also watch a lot of, movies. So if you like what I do, if you want to support what I do, please like the video, please leave a comment, please subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to get to 30 subscribers by the end of July, which I think I can do without any problems because you guys are wonderful. All right. What do you think about the book? Leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. Thank you. Bye-bye.